Hello and welcome to painting Kings of War, Shadows in the North, the 2-player starter set. Part 1, Butchers. Okay, so we're going to start off with some preparation. We need to get these guys ready for priming. This is just how I like to prepare these miniatures for a quick paint job. I want to make sure I can prime them all at once, and I do use an airbrush, so I like to just drill a small hole in the feet or the base, but in this case the feet. Put a bit of wire in, could be a paper clip, drill the holes in the bottom of the feet, put the wires in, super glue them in, pop them in the corks, works perfectly. Now I wanted this to be a quick project, I didn't really want to do any gap filling. I have already basically cut off the mould lines on these guys. They're a hard plastic PVC according to Mantic. It's not really like the plastic that you get on a Games Workshop model or some of Mantic's newer plastic models that is. It's not a very nice material to work with when it comes to getting rid of mould lines. But I have done my best to cut those off. You do really need to actually cut them off with a knife. You can't scrape them. So fill in the gaps here. I didn't want to fill the gaps, I wanted it to be a quick project, but the gaps were quite bad around the arms. So using some green stuff, pushing it in with the moulding tool here, the shaping tool, making sure it's wet. That's what you can see me doing, just wiping the water off on my thumb. Not doing an amazing job here, just trying to smooth over the gaps, just so that when we paint it, it looks okay. Okay, so you can see that I've primed the model here, but what I've actually done with it, so I primed it black with a black primer. You could do that with a spray can, but I use an airbrush. And then from above I've sprayed it with a light grey. You could use a white, but I'm using a light grey. I've also used a white ink sprayed from above. So the zenithal priming on here will really lead into the type of painting that I'm going to do to try and get these done quickly. But what I find is that we really do need a good overbrush of white paint to pick out extra highlights, pick out the edges. This step is really quite essential when it comes to the painting stages that we're going to do. If we don't do this, everything's just a little bit grey. We really want the main highlights to pop out a bit, and that's what the white paint's going to do. It's going to pick out those raised edges. You can really kind of see, there we go, you can really kind of see the difference between the model from above, the model from below. It's going to be a lot darker underneath. It's going to give that zenithal look when everything's painted. And it also makes the next step quite quick because we've already got the highlight and the shadows in place. Now I didn't show a lot of the priming steps, but from here on in we're going to cover the painting in a bit more detail. We're using Games Workshop contrast paints Magos purple and black Templar, as well as some blue game colour ink from Vallejo. These are going to make a kind of heavy glaze / wash, and we're going to go over the zenithal highlighting that we've already done. There's the zenithal pre-shading as well, which basically just means that we've got the shadows and the highlights in a black and white already on the model. And then we're going to tint that black and white into the colours that we want on the model. What I want here is a kind of dark blacky blue with a little bit of a warm tone to it so that it blends well with other parts of the model that I want to be more of a purpley red. So you can see here that I've got a fair bit of Magos purple, some black Templar, but only a couple of drops of the blue. Going to mix that up and you can see this quite a darky blue ink colour. That's kind of what I'm going for. I want it to be like a bluer version of the typical alien that you'd get, you know, like on the Alien films. There you can see it's quite thin, but not super thin like a really thin glaze. Quite black. I actually want it more blue than that. This blue ink is quite strong, so I'd rather start out with not putting too much in it. Just using a fairly cheap brush here to mix it up. I don't want to get, you know, don't want to use a really nice brush to do the mixing here. There we go. You can see that's a lot bluer now. This is a reasonably straightforward step. It's just simply a case of painting the bits I want blue. I say it's simple, but it's not quite the same as using an opaque paint. It's hard to explain, but the contrast paint really needs to like flow off the brush rather than you painting it onto the model. You're kind of guiding the paint, the ink, whatever you want to call it. You're kind of guiding it into the place that you want it. You want to kind of move the brush from an area of highlight towards an area of shade so that you deposit more of the paint into the darker area. You don't really want to have a really dark blue patch of paint right where a highlight's meant to be, so like right on the end of the knee or one of those muscles that are standing out. Just going to speed this up a bit, and I'm going to do that throughout the video. You can still kind of see what's going on. Because this method relies on effectively tinting the black and white base coat, it's quite important not to get any of the paint, or not too much of the paint, on areas that you're going to be painting with a different colour. So here I'm trying to be careful not to get it on that, whatever you call it, the groin rug. But I don't mind if it goes towards the areas that are going to be painted with a more of a red colour, because I do want them to blend together. Just being careful, trying to not let it pool in areas that I want to be highlighted. I'm probably not completely accurate or I'm not completely successful in this. And that's really because I'm trying to make this a speed paint. I want it to be quite quick. So, getting onto the head now, we'll come into an area which I want to be blending in. I want the hair, or the tentacles on the back of the head that look a bit like hair, to be red, as well as the tentacles on the arms, on the hands. So I'm just being careful here around the teeth, because they're going to be painted a different colour. I don't want the mouth to be too blue either. I want that to be a bit more red. Not too worried about those horns underneath his chin though, because I'm going to be painting the horns and the teeth in an opaque colour. So that basically means I can re-base coat those if I want to. I'm not relying on that undercoat colour that we had with the zenithal. What I've done here is I've just I've cleaned the brush off. The brush is now just wet. I'm just sort of blending out the blue. There you go, you can see that there. Blending the blue out, because that area is going to be red, so I want the blue to fade out a little bit. I don't really want a solid line of the blue paint, because when you try to blend it in with the red, once the blue's dry, it really won't work very well. Here we can see the difference of where we've got to so far. You know, if you're just going for a quick tabletop result, I think that looks pretty good. Once it's dry, that would look okay. A little bit desaturated, but okay. So now we're going to go with red ink and Magos purple. So we're using the Magos purple in both the blue and the red parts of the model to try and tie them together a bit with that kind of plummy colour. The red ink is definitely not as strongly pigmented as the blue, so we need a little bit more than what we would have put in for the blue. So you can see I'm using less Magos purple than I did with the blue mix. The blue paint is pretty much dry now, or almost dry. I'm going to focus on the areas that haven't been painted so far, so really the tentacles, the mouth, the tongue, not doing that hairy groin patch. That's going to be a different colour. You'll be surprised to hear I don't really want the eye focusing on the groin. So painting this all over here and letting it bleed a little bit into the areas that were already blue, because I want those tentacles to be a bit more red. I get to this point in a minute and I think that actually this isn't red enough, so I'm going to stop what I'm doing and add a couple more drops of red ink. I really want it to be a bit more vibrant. That's really just an indication that the red ink is not as highly pigmented as the blue. Also, the black Templar contrast paint is quite highly pigmented, or it feels like that to me. You only need a few drops of that and it does turn everything quite black, or definitely adds a lot more tone to it. There we go, you can see that's a lot more towards a kind of a cherry colour almost. When it dries, it's not quite as bright as that. It is a little bit more plummy. Just adding a bit of that mix as well, like around the gums. I want those to look red. I want them to look a bit sore and a bit manky. Some Magos Dunes contrast paint here. I'm mixing that with a little bit of the skin colour. Now the idea of this was to come up with a colour for the hair around his groin area. That sounds weird. The fur. What should we call it? His midriff fur. I wanted it to tie in but be different from the skin. I will actually change that later. I don't particularly like it's a little bit muddy, it's a little bit green, it's not quite what I was after. But the principle of using colours that are consistent across the model does work. Nice and straightforward this. Black Templar out the part over all the weapon areas. You can see here quite how highly pigmented it is for what is basically a pigmented wash. Do have to be quite careful with this because any of that black goes over the blue, the red, or any areas that haven't been painted yet, and you really need to get it off quickly with a wet brush or it will be hard to paint over. Well, not hard to paint over, but it'll be hard to paint over with the speed and the style that we're going for. I really am aiming for this to be a reasonably quick speed paint. That really is the aim of this channel and this project in particular, of like getting it done, not trying to make the model so amazing that we just never finish it. Okay, so I realised that I jumped ahead and done the metals, or the base coat for the metals that is. I hadn't even done his hair. I'm going to call it his hair, but his tentacles, but if I call it his hair, you know what I'm talking about. So I want that to be the same sort of red colour as the tentacles on his hands. I'm mixing the two skin colours together now, the ones on his body and the ones on his hair, to get a more purpley plum colour. Just going to carefully paint a little bit of that on the bridge between the blue, which is now dry, and the red on the tentacles of the hair, which is a little bit wet. Just kind of blending it together on the model. Not worried if I stipple a bit on and you end up with a little bit of the darker purple as a patch on the lighter red colour of the tentacles, because this is meant to be kind of like a natural skin. There's going to be mottles. Just don't want it to look too much like it's just pooled paint. Okay, so here we are compared to the zenithal prime model. Again, you know, pop a few of those on a base, perfectly good enough for tabletop quality. Excluding the zenithal, that's taken about 15 minutes. Okay, you're going to notice that the video looks a little bit different from here in. That's because I bought a new light setup. I did review this light. You can find that on my channel. It's going to make the colours look a little bit different. What I also did was have a slight setup change to my camera to get a better angle, or what I thought was a better angle, but all you've really got is a great video of my head. You have to trust me when I just say that the difference that you're seeing in the colour is basically the difference in the lighting. So he just looks a little bit more blue. Okay, so we're going to use normal paint here. It's just normal opaque paint. You could use any kind of bone colour paint. You can see that I started making a little bit of a mistake there. The paint was too thin. It ran into the gaps between the teeth, and I had to fix it up with a wet brush. It's always good to keep a wet brush right ready to go in case you need to mop up a bit of paint that's gone in the wrong place. Get it quick before it dries. So I'm really just base coating the teeth here. It's quite straightforward, but I wouldn't say easy. This guy's teeth are a little bit hard to paint. They're a bit all over the place. Okay, the paint has been thinned down a little bit, so I am doing a couple of coats. You can see me going back over some of the bits that I don't think have got enough coverage. I'm trying to make it quite opaque. Going to do exactly the same with the claws. If we were trying to do these with the same ink or contrast paint method, we'd have had to have made sure that we didn't get any other paint over that zenithal base coat, and that would have been a real pain. It would have slowed the project down. That's why I think it's worth spending the time now going over it with an opaque paint rather than having to have been so careful with the initial base layer of the blue and the purples. That would have taken us absolutely ages, and it really wouldn't have been a speed paint job. I wanted this to be a case that if you didn't want to paint these bone areas, you really could have left it with just the skin, just the tentacles, and it would have looked fine on the tabletop. And we didn't want that process to take absolutely ages by being really careful and avoiding the bone areas. I'm going to use some Magos dunes here. Yeah, I do love this paint. This is one of my favourite contrast paints. Snakebite leather is a little bit more highly pigmented, a bit more orange, does the job a bit quicker, but the Magos dunes is amazing. You can mix it with any of the different inks, some red ink, some brown ink, some chestnut ink, some skin ink. Mix it with any of those different inks, and you've got a huge range of leathery type colours, leathery and bone type colours straight away. I'm really just using the Magos dunes like a wash really over all the bone areas to make it seem more yellow. Using a smaller brush here to get some control. You can see that I'm painting it from the point of the bone and the teeth towards the skin or towards the gums, and that's so that we leave a heavier amount of the paint in those areas and it will end up darker. Kind of just an easy way to give a good transition, a good blend from the tip of the bone, which should be more highlighted. I say should be more highlighted, bone isn't always highlighted towards the tip, but in this case I wanted it to be like that. So I'm just coming back in with the Vallejo Model Colour Ivory, but I'm mixing in a little bit of that Magos dunes that we used. This is a really good selling point of the contrast paints in my opinion, is that you can use them in their normal way. You get the highlights naturally from painting over a light undercoat, or in our case a zenithal undercoat, but then you can add in some opaque paint, it thickens it up a little bit, and you can do your highlights like that. So in this case I want a warm highlight, so I'm using ivory. Later we'll use exactly the same approach, but with the blue skin we'll add some white, because we want it to be cool. We don't want to add an ivory colour to the blue paint. I'm really just focusing on the areas that need to be highlighted, so kind of towards the ends of the teeth, but I'm not that bothered if I cover most of the teeth. I want the yellow to stay around the gum, as he's, you know, he doesn't go to the dentist, this guy. Highlight the claws with some of this mixture towards the ends of the claws. It's kind of a natural way to highlight claws and bones on a figure like this, even if in real life the bone might actually be darker towards the tips. It's doing it this way, although it might not be as realistic. I say realistic, I've never seen one of these guys in real life, but you know what I mean. It just makes it easier to highlight and it looks quite good. Yeah, I'm looking at this guy now and I'm thinking, yeah, this guy would be fine on the tabletop, bit of metallic paint a bit later and it would be amazing. But what I want to do here now is go an extra step and make the skin a little bit more interesting by using the Magos purple to just add some interest, really. Add a little bit of interest to different areas of the model. I'm going to go on areas where I think the skin would be stretched, so knees, elbows, and kind of around the neck where his massive muscles are bulging in his neck, or his sort of neck tendons are all taut. We're just glazing it in straight out the pot, but being really careful to paint it towards the dark areas. We don't want to use the paint straight out of the pot and have it pool. I've wiped a lot of it off on the brush and it really is like a glaze. I'm also using the purple to blend a little bit between the blue and the red areas. Using some more of that Magos purple here just to sort of add a little bit of warmth into the muscle shadows. I think it really makes the skin more interesting not to have the blue areas just blue and the red areas just red. So we're going to sort out these weapons now. Vallejo metals are pretty good. I like using these paints. They go on really nice and smooth, but we don't want that effect with these guys. You know, these guys are not straight out from the armory. They're going about, they're killing, they're doing a lot of damage. I want them to look like they've been in a fight. So I'm using a really old Citadel brush here. This brush is painted probably 400 or 500 clan rats. I don't want to get rid of it because I really like it. I use it now for painting metallics. You just need an old brush that's kind of a bit dead. Using the paint basically out the pot. It's not really a dry brush, the paint is still on there. I haven't wiped nearly all of it off, but I have wiped a little bit off. It's not flowing off the brush. It gives a kind of a scratchy look across the metal, so we paint it in the direction that we think it should be on the blade. Using Vallejo silver paint here, which is a lot brighter, just to provide some highlights. So we're hitting kind of the edges of the blade, the part of the blade where the part of the cleaver I should say, where the front edge of the blade meets the flat edge. Again, you can see I'm not being particularly careful here. I could be a lot more careful, but this is meant to be a reasonably quick speed paint job. Kind of really just thinking of putting those highlights where they would be if the light was coming from above, because that's how we've highlighted the skin with the zenithal priming. Some Hachette copper from Games Workshop here, painting the spiky edge thing there on the cleaver. Using the same kind of approach here, not painting it on fully, kind of using a heavy overbrush. It basically just leaves some darker areas in the shadows and makes the blade look worn. It's just a quick way of making it look pretty worn. It also makes the cleaver look a little bit more interesting, painting the copper on the edge part here with the spikes, as opposed to the blade being a kind of a dirty steel colour. Okay, we're going to carry on with the weapons for a little bit here. Just going to use a couple of Games Workshop washes, and we're going to add a little bit of a surprise towards the end. Just using Seraphim Sepia, covering the brass areas. It'll just warm it up a little bit while providing some shading, letting the wash flow off the tip of the brush there onto the flat edge of the blade, just to pool into the area between the brass colour and the silver colour, just to provide some extra depth there. This really is just a case of covering the whole of it reasonably heavily, letting it pool around the spiky bits and around the transition between the silver blade and the brass part. Okay, so you can see here that I've forgotten to paint the handles. Just going in with some Doomball brown. Really like this as a kind of a browny red kind of colour. I wanted to go with something that was similar to what we've already used, so I wanted some of the red still in there. Okay, now here's a surprise I was talking about. We've got some Vallejo Game Colour Skin Wash. I'm going to pop that on the palette so it's ready to go, because we need to be able to access it quickly. So firstly, we're just going to use Agrax Earthshade. Brilliant for washing, kind of like dirty blades, basically. Like I said, this guy's not come straight out the armourer. He's been using this cleaver quite a lot. Really just going to cover all the steel areas with a good wash. Not super duper heavy, but making sure that it completely covers. So it's going to tint all the metal towards a brown, dirty colour. And it will sit in the recesses, in the gap between the steel blade and the brass edge. Also using this just straight over the handles. Okay, so using the skin wash, here's the little secret part. Not secret, bit of a surprise though. Just stippling the skin wash straight on, and this is our quick and easy way of producing a reasonably good rust effect. Again, we're talking about speed painting here. I don't want to spend absolutely ages on all these guys. I've got a whole box set to paint up. So I'm stippling this on while the Agrax Earthshade is still wet. That's why we needed it available pretty quickly. Not being too precise, I'm just kind of thinking like, where would the blade be most rusty? And where's it going to look good, really? This isn't a science project. It's just got to look good. Well, it's got to look okay. It's got to look okay for the standards that we're setting for our project. That's kind of what this channel's about. It's about getting stuff painted to a standard that we're happy with. And from my point of view, I want this painted to a standard that I'm happy with. So I think it just needs to look pretty good. Here's what the cleaver looks like now, and the sickle in his other hand. I think that rust effect is pretty good for, what, a minute's work? So just a little bit of careful dry brushing now on all the raised areas, because that wash really does dull down the metal. I am being a bit careful though. I am making sure that it's more of a dry brush, because that Vallejo Model Colour silver is very bright, and this is meant to be a dull rusty blade that we really just want a few areas popping out. Trying to catch the nicks and cuts that are on the blade edge there. Any areas that would have been damaged and had the rust knocked off them as he's been cleaving skulls. I'm also, to make things quick, just using the silver to highlight the brass as well. You could totally skip this step if you're trying to get a really quick paint job, but I do want these guys to look pretty good on the tabletop. That's kind of what I'm expecting from them. But I do like to paint them in stages, so if I'd really needed to get it ready, I'd have just based it up and had it ready. Could have gone back in and painted these extra bits later. You can see, as with most dry brushing, we're just trying to catch the edges that we want to be the most highlighted. Using the edge of the brush is often the most effective way of doing this. But I also don't mind if this old brush ends up stippling the paint a little bit, because I do want it to look like a rough blade. So here's what we've got so far with the whole model. I'm pretty happy with this. I would quite happily just chuck it straight on the table, but I want to go that extra step and see what we can do to make it look a little bit better. And there's only 3 of these guys in the starter set, so I don't mind spending a bit more time on them. So using a contrast medium and the 2 inks that we've already used previously, just making a thinner glaze of just the red and just the blue, just to turn the red parts of the skin more red and the blue parts of the skin a little bit more blue. Now this isn't a wash, this is a glaze, so don't want it pooling. You can see I made a mistake there, got some of it on the teeth, quickly went in with a wet brush to take it off. Yeah, like I said, this is a glaze, so it's nice and thin. There's a reasonable amount of it on the brush, but I'm wicking off a fair amount of it so that when I paint it onto the model, it goes where I want it and it doesn't pool. That is quite important. You can see here I'm using that red over some of the other areas of the model that are also blue, like we did earlier. The knees, the heels, and underneath some of the muscles. I'm also using it on the veins that are popping out on his arms, just again to give some more interest to the model, break up the big slab of blue. I also did the same with the blue, but most of that was off camera. Okay, so I decided that I wanted to highlight the fur a little bit more. And like I said earlier, I've actually off camera painted basically just 1 coat of Agros Dune straight out the pot over the fur area, which has turned it more from a kind of bit of a muddy green to a bit more of a yellow tone. So I'm mixing in the same mixture that I use on the teeth actually, a little bit more towards the yellow. This is a size 1 Rosemary & Co. Series 33. Nice brush, not bad. Not particularly thin, this paint. The contrast paint provides some dilution to the model colour ivory. So what I'm trying to do here is just highlight some of those individual strands of fur, mainly the ones that would catch the light from above, so I won't be highlighting any of the stuff underneath. I'm really just carefully highlighting some select areas of some select strands of the fur here. I don't really want to do a dry brush on this because I don't want it to look powdery. Just taking my time here. This is a little bit unnecessary when it comes to the whole thing being a speed paint project, but I wanted to just see what I could do in a reasonably quick period of time, get these guys looking a bit better. So using the side of the brush here is actually quite handy. A little bit more ivory to the mix here, just to sort of make some of the fur area pop a little bit more. Not being particularly scientific about the highlight placements, other than trying to keep the highlights sort of like along a horizontal plane across the fur. If you see someone with really nice sort of blonde hair, you'll notice that the hair isn't highlighted like right from top to bottom. It'll catch the light in certain areas, especially when it's like a wavy type of hair or fur, which this guy's groin fur is a little bit like that. He seems to take more care of his groin fur than his weapons by the look of it. Nightmares have standards too, you know. I wanted the bone areas again to have a little bit more contrast to them, so I'm using some Seraphim Sepia straight out the pot on all the areas that are the closest to the skin. So just pushing that wash from the tip towards the skin areas, but making sure it doesn't go too much onto the skin. Don't really want to start turning the blue of the skin yellow or green. This is another step that isn't completely necessary, but it just makes those bone areas pop out a little bit. This just adds a little bit more contrast to the claws and teeth. I like the look that it gives. It's fairly time consuming though to do it carefully. I say time consuming, 10 minutes maybe. Over 3 models though, that's half an hour. Again, if you're trying to get this project done quickly, maybe it's not necessary. I do need to be careful with that personally. I could spend a lot longer on this model and the whole project will be sat on the shelf for months and months and months. Maybe I'll never even finish it. That's not what I want. So we're going to use the same approach here of mixing the contrast paint mix in with an opaque paint. The highlighting of the skin here is a really good example of how this can work really well. We get what I think is to be a really good natural highlight for this skin colour just by adding the elfic flesh. So the elfic flesh is a warm colour, and I picked that because it fits with the warm colour of the red on his arms, well, the pinky plummy red colour. So I'm starting out with just picking out some areas that are already highlighted because of the work we did at the start with the base coat, but I just want them to stand out a little bit more, and the opaqueness of the paint kind of just makes them a bit more defined. Because our initial undercoat, our initial zenithal work was finished with a dry brush, even though I was quite careful, some of the areas do look a little bit scratchy, and so adding this opaque paint really moves those areas out a little bit. As I was doing this, I realised that I didn't want this colour to sit on top of the existing colours that we already have in a flat kind of way. I wanted it to be more natural. You know, we've already used some stippling on the model when we were mixing, or when we were blending between the blue and the red, so I highlighted them in a more traditional manner, just the bits around the fingers really where they needed to stand out, but now I'm using the brush in a stippling manner to add some of these highlights to the veins, to the rest of the fingers, to some of the sinews. Using it on the tentacles as well in a stippling manner really gives a nice kind of like natural highlight, adds a bit of texture to the model as well. I think it looks good. So I'm using that stippling approach on the hair, on the tentacle hair as well. Using the side of the brush a little bit on the top. I'm really just thinking like where would the light's coming from above, which areas would be highlighted. I'm highlighting it in a similar way that I would highlight hair, so making it lighter towards the ends, but also picking some areas that would catch the light sort of halfway down the hair and also directly on the top. But I'm being careful not to use this warm colour to highlight where the tentacles go into the blue. Just added a bit more elfic flesh to the mix here, just to add a final highlight on some of the areas that we've already highlighted with the previous mix. Faces, hands, weapons, those are the areas that we want people to be focusing on when we're looking at the model, so it's worth spending a little bit more time on those areas. It's kind of all about picking and choosing your battles really. You want it done reasonably quickly, you want the model on the tabletop. We only really want to spend time improving the model in areas that are going to really make a difference, unless it's for competition or something. I've got a lot of models to paint up for this project and I want them done. We're not meant to be procrastinating. This is one of the ways that I do procrastinate, if I'm honest. I'll spend too long on a model to the point where I feel like I'm not getting anywhere. I get demoralised, I don't get the project done, and that's not going to happen on this project. Just kind of finishing off really by adding an extra little bit of highlights to those veins on the arms because they're a really good area of interest, and also around the mouth, again another area of interest, the tongue in particular, making the tip of the tongue look highlighted. but also the ridge on the top of the tongue. Again, highlighting it a bit like hair, thinking about like where would the light hit, rather than trying to highlight down the whole length. You know, I think the highlighting on the skin here is really making it pop. It does in some way desaturate the redness by adding the elfic flesh, but overall I think it works well. I think the stippling is a really good effect for a creature like this. He's, you know, I'm thinking like, you know, real life as such. This guy would have spots, he'd have blemishes all over him. You can see on the left shoulder actually the way that this the way that this PVC plastic model is made. It has a weird pattern on it, and I've let the blue pool in that area, and it's made it look really cool, kind of like a mottled kind of look. So I'm definitely not going to paint over that. That was a really good accident. It's a happy accident. Using the blue mix, we're going to add just some straight white, because we don't want the highlight for the blue to be warm. We want it to be cool. Same approach really as the highlighting the red skin here. We're just going to pick out the areas that are most interesting that we want highlighted. As a general rule of thumb, it's always going to be from above because we're using a zenithal highlighting. You can really see that cool mottling on the shoulders here, so I'm kind of working with that, not trying to paint over it. Just kind of trying to catch the top of some of these muscles with a kind of just a careful stippling really, not trying to slather on a big patch of the highlight colour. Catch the edge of the muscles here. This guy's been working out. He's pretty rock hard. Don't need to do too much work actually. The sculpt is really good when it comes to the muscle definition, and the zenithal undercoating that we did is already making those muscles stand out. This is just a final touch really, not necessary for a battle ready army, but these are your monstrous infantry. You kind of want to make maybe just these models stand out a bit more than the standard troops. Just going around and maybe adding an extra layer here of the highlight because it is stippling. I'm not putting it on really thick. Just getting the areas that I really want to stand out. Around the face, the muscles, the top of big muscle groups, just to make it stand out a bit more. Especially around the forehead here, just being really quite careful. So I want that area to look good. Just a really quick and easy highlight on the handle of the weapons here. Just mixing a bit of Doomball brown with some Scrofulous brown. Just using some Doomball brown to bring out the area that we've covered in Agrat's Earth. Agrat's Earth turns this into a really dark red quite quickly. Adding in a bit of scruffy brown here as a highlight, just a bit more towards the orange. Not putting a huge amount of effort in here because I think people are going to be looking, mainly at the blades. I really don't want to spend as much time on a handle of a weapon as you do on like the face of a model, for example. Okay, I've got the brightest silver paint I've got here just to go in and add a few more final highlights. I say final, you'll see me go back in again in a second. But I've got to the point now where I'm going a little bit over and above what I wanted to achieve with this model. And, I've got to be careful here that I don't spend so long on it that I don't get anything else done. Just picking out a few areas that I want to really pop a little bit more. In particular, I want some of the damage on the edge of that blade there. You can see a few nicks in the blade. Really want to accentuate those by painting the lower edge of them with the silver. It's really carefully just touching it with the silver. There's some little rivets on the blade as well. We'll catch those and the ends of the brass spikes with the silver, just as the final highlight of where the light would strike from above. Really want to bring out the nicks in the blade to show that this blade is well used. some Citadel Abaddon black here, thinned down a little bit. Just going to go in with the black into the areas of the blade where there's nicks. So that's directly above the areas that I painted with silver. These are actually moulded into the model here. But I really want to make them a little bit darker. Just making sure we've got a sharp point on the brush so we can really get in there and define those nicks. You can see my head in the way there. I'm leaning in and concentrating quite hard on this. Back in with a bit of silver now, just to re-highlight some of the areas where the black might have just touched the highlights, and we want them to really stand out from the dark recesses that the black has been put into. And again, you can see me working back in a little bit of black. Really just a little bit of back and forth until I'm happy with the result. Okay, thin the black down a little bit more now, just for hopefully a final pass here. Just to go back into all those small areas. The thinned down Abaddon black does need a couple of coats to, stand out nice and stark. Saying that, I don't want it to be super black. I want a little bit of the colour of the blade showing through, so it's not full coverage from the black here, but pretty close to it. I really want that to be a visual focus on this model. You see me black lining between the two types of metal there, and also on the handle. So here's the finished model. I think it looks really good for a reasonably quick paint job. I think overall it's probably about an hour and a half, a couple of hours work maybe, plus the time on the zenithal base coating. But I think that's really worth it. I think it's a good result, and it is a monstrous infantry model for an army, so you can spend a bit more time on it than you would do on a normal infantry model. Here's a couple of photos of the model once finished. Thanks for watching right through to the end. If you like the video, give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see some more. In particular though, I'd really like to hear your comments. Let me know what you think of the video, any things you would do differently. Let me know what you think of the models.